colossal shadow rolls onto her side in the cold Pacific waters of November 29, 1944. Shinano lists helplessly as seawater floods through gaping holes in her massive hull. Her massive length stretches across the waves one final time before her stern rises skyward and she begins to plunge into the depths. A thunderous roar of collapsing metal erupts as this steel leviathan disappears beneath the surface, with over 1,000 still aboard. How did the largest aircraft carrier in World War II sink just 10 days after commissioning? Shinano was laid down on May 4, 1940, at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. She was intended to be the third ship in the Yamato-class battleships, which also included Musashi and Yamato. However, Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers in 1942 at the Battle of Midway. The naval war dynamics were also shifting from battleships to carrier-based aircraft combat, thus creating an urgent need for carriers for the Imperial Japanese Navy. That's when they decided to convert Shinano's partially constructed hull into an aircraft carrier. But considering the progress they had already made in constructing the hull as a battleship, Shinano was finished as a support carrier instead of a conventional fleet carrier. In 1944, the Japanese Navy suffered yet another defeat in the Philippine Sea, and this increased the urgency to have Shinano completed. Worse, they lacked enough skilled labour and experienced material shortages. In haste, they used lower quality materials, welding was done poorly, and many systems were not completed, compromises that would later prove fatal for the carrier. Shinano was 872 feet long and displaced 72,000 tons at full load. Fitted with 4 steam turbines, she could generate 150,000 shaft horsepower and reach a top speed of 27 knots. She retained the already installed 15.7-inch belt armour, but it was reduced to 6.3 inches in the other areas. Her defences included 16 5-inch dual-purpose guns, over 100 anti-aircraft guns, and 12 4.7-inch anti-aircraft rocket launchers. With a single hangar deck, Shinano could carry up to 47 aircraft and 120 reserve aircraft for the other carriers. She wasn't merely another replacement for the destroyed carriers, she was Japan's surprise secret weapon. Her construction was kept secret. A giant fence surrounded the shipyard, and workers weren't allowed to leave the naval yard or even utter a single word about the supercarrier. The security was so effective that the Allies had no idea she existed. However, in late 1944, American B-29 bombers were beginning to reach the Japanese mainland. Yokosuka was now within their striking range, and Shinano was at risk of being destroyed during surprise air raids. As a result, the Japanese High Command decided to move her to the much safer Kure Naval Base for her final fitting out and sea trials. Shinano was commissioned on November 19, 1944, at Yokosuka under the command of Captain Toshio Abe. His first mission was to ensure Shinano reached Kure safely and also transport 50 Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka kamikaze planes and a number of Shinyo suicide boats. However, after inspecting the ship, the captain discovered a massive problem. Many watertight and bulkhead doors were missing, and the ones installed were yet to be tested. The electrical systems, pipes, and important systems were still being installed, but were way too far from being completed. Worse, she lacked critical pumps and damage control equipment. He instantly knew that sailing was extremely risky, and more time was needed for the ship to be completed. He requested additional time from the Japanese High Command for Shinano to be completed, but the decision had already been made. Shinano must be moved to Kure Naval Base, and it had to be done fast. The special kamikaze weapons were loaded into the hangar by the crew and technicians who were working on the ship. Shinano was yet to get her air wing, so she would set sail with her new, inexperienced crew and civilian technicians who were to continue working on the ship at Kure. On November 28, 1944, Shinano departed Yokosuka at 6 p.m. with destroyers Isakaze, Yukikaze, and Hamakaze as escorts. Captain Abe set course southwest at 20 knots, ordering a zigzag pattern to confuse any submarines that might be lurking in the dangerous waters. Actually, Commander Joseph Enright's American submarine, USS Archer Fish, was hunting in these very waters. At a few minutes to 9 p.m, Archerfish's radar operator detected contact, and the Japanese formation was visible through the binoculars. Around 10:30 p.m, lookouts aboard Shinano spotted the submarine's conning tower. Isakaze immediately broke formation and charged towards the submarine. But Captain Abe suspected it to be a decoy, so he ordered the destroyer back to formation. Instead of attacking, he chose to turn away and increase speed, hoping to outrun the submarine, a decision that's debated to date. For a while, this strategy seemed to work. However, before midnight, a bearing in one of Shinano's main propeller shafts began overheating due to poor maintenance during her rushed construction. Captain Abe was forced to reduce speed from 20 knots to 18 knots, almost exactly the same speed as the pursuing Archerfish. The submarine trailed Shinano while staying just beyond visual range, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to strike. In the early morning hours of November the 29th, 1944, Shinano made a zigzag maneuver to port. Unknowingly, Shinano's massive flank turned directly toward Archerfish. At 3:15 a.m, the submarine fired 6 torpedoes towards the carrier and then dove deep immediately to escape the inevitable counterattack. 4 torpedoes hit the starboard side of Shinano's hull. To make matters worse, they all struck at the weakest point, along the joint between the original battleship armour and the newer carrier conversion sections. The first torpedo struck near the stern, flooding refrigerated compartments and an empty aviation fuel tank. The second hit the hulls forward, flooding the main engine room. The third torpedo hit under a boiler room, flooding 2 adjacent boiler rooms. The fourth hit was near the air compressor room, flooding it along with nearby magazines and damaging a critical damage control station. Shinano listed 10 degrees to starboard, but was still under control. However, Captain Abe made a fatal error. Instead of stopping to assess the damage and allow repair crews to work effectively, he maintained Shinano's 18-knot speed. This forced more water into the ship through the gaping torpedo holes. The damage control teams fought desperately below decks. However, the untested watertight compartments began leaking, and the poorly welded joints worsened the situation. The civilian workers panicked, hindering the crew's efforts to save the ship. The destroyer escorts attempted to tow Shinano, but they were no match for the giant carrier that was now heavy with water. The ship's electrical power failed at 9 a.m, plunging the ship's interior into darkness and silencing the few pumps that were still working. An hour later, the list had already exceeded 30 degrees, and that's when Captain Abe finally gave the order to abandon ship. Following the honourable tradition of Japanese naval officers, he chose to remain on the bridge and go down with his ship. At 10:57 a.m, Shinano rolled completely over to starboard, with her hull visible for a moment against the sky, before she slid stern first beneath the waves. Of the 2,515 sailors, officers and civilian workers aboard, 1,435 died. Captain Abe and many senior officers went down with the ship, while escort destroyers rescued just over 1,000 survivors. The survivors were quarantined on a remote island and sworn to absolute secrecy. The Navy kept the loss a state secret until after the war to protect morale. Meanwhile, USS Archerfish escaped undetected. Commander Enright and his crew knew they had sunk something large, but didn't know its identity. US naval intelligence initially dismissed Enright's claim of sinking a carrier and credited him with a smaller kill, since they had no records of Shinano's existence. But after the war, Enright and his crew were recognized for achieving the largest submarine kill in naval history. For Japan, the loss was catastrophic. The sinking cost them their largest carrier, and the special suicide weapons meant for use during the war didn't reach their intended destination. Shinano never lived up to her potential. Actually, she ended up being the largest warship ever to be sunk by a submarine.